It wasn't the thunder that woke Amelia Hayes, it was the silence that came after. Out on Blackwood Ridge, a silence like that is a promise that something, somewhere, has just broken. And in the Arizona Territory, miles from the nearest town of Redemption Creek, a broken thing was always Amelia's problem. She lit the lantern, and the little cabin walls jumped with shadows, long and thin like skeletal fingers. She pulled on her dead husband's coat, the oilskin cool against her arms. The wind was screaming a warning outside, but another sound slipped underneath it, a low, guttural moan. It wasn't an animal. It was the sound of a man trying to breathe through a chest full of his own blood. The sky had torn open, and it was bleeding rain onto the parched earth, a fury of water and wind that hammered her sod roof like a war drum. For 3 years, since Thomas had been taken by the fever, this land's profound loneliness had been her only companion. She knew its moods, from the sun-drugged stupor of midday to the biting, predatory chill of the desert night. But this storm was different. This one felt personal. She'd been mending a harness by candlelight when the first crash came, a sound like a giant snapping a bone. Then the terrified whinny of her horse, Balthazar, from the lean-to. Her heart became a frantic bird beating against her ribs. She grabbed the heavy Winchester rifle, her constant friend, and crept to the door. She peered through a crack in the timber. The rain was a solid, churning sheet of silver, turning the world into a nightmare. She couldn't see a thing. Then she heard it again. The moan. It was undeniably human. It cut through the storm's roar with a terrifying, intimate clarity. Every instinct she had, every lesson learned from 3 years of solitary survival, screamed at her. Bar the door, douse the light, disappear. The folks in town were always talking. The Apache are restless, they'd say. Sterling Thorne's ranch hands would talk of skirmishes, of missing livestock, their words always dripping with a particular kind of venom. A lone woman out here wasn't just a target. She was an invitation. But there was another voice inside her, one that sounded a lot like her father, the old country doctor who taught her how to set a bone, how to stitch a wound. "You don't let a soul bleed out in the mud," he'd always said, no matter the color of their skin. With a curse that was half a prayer, Amelia unlatched the heavy door and stepped out into the gale. The wind hit her like a fist, stealing her breath, plastering her thin calico dress to her skin. The lantern's flame danced and sputtered, threatening to abandon her to the suffocating liquid dark. Shielding it with one hand, the Winchester heavy in the other, she followed the sound. Her boots sank into the mud, which grabbed at her ankles like greedy hands. She found him by the broken fence line. He was Apache. The stark high planes of his face, the long black hair plastered to his skull, the buckskin leggings. There was no mistaking it. He was sprawled on his side, one arm flung out, the other pressed tight to his ribs. A dark, syrupy pool was spreading out from under him, thinning as the rain washed it away. Amelia raised the Winchester, her knuckles turning bone white. He was a warrior, built of lean, hard muscle that was now shuddering from the cold and the shock. His eyes were closed, his face a mask of pure agony. Her gaze dropped to the wound. A bullet hole, ugly and torn, high on his right side. It was bad. The angle was all wrong. It had probably gone through a lung. He couldn't be one of Thorne's men. They wouldn't leave one of their own to die in the mud. This man was a renegade, a raider, the very boogeyman that haunted the dreams of every settler in Redemption Creek. The smart thing to do was to leave him. The sensible thing was to walk back inside and bar the door. Dragging him into her home was pure madness. It was an invitation for his people to come looking for him, or worse, an invitation for a posse to accuse her of being a sympathizer, an accomplice. Either path led to a rope or a fire. And then his eyes flickered open. They were the color of dark, wet stone, and for a single stunning moment they burned with a lucid fire. He saw her. He saw the rifle. He saw the lantern light glinting off the wet steel barrel. He didn't make a move. He didn't plead. There was only a quiet, defiant acceptance of his fate. He had lived the life of a warrior, and this was how a warrior died. In that instant, he stopped being a symbol of fear. He was just a man, about her own age, dying in the dirt at her feet. Amelia's resolve crumbled into dust. The doctor's daughter had won. "Damn it all to hell," she muttered, lowering the rifle. Getting him to the cabin was a nightmare. He was a dead weight of muscle and bone, heavier than he looked. She hooked her arms under his, her boots slipping in the slick, grasping mud. She strained, she grunted, she fell to her knees twice, but she didn't let go. Every inch was a hard-won victory. He was barely conscious, his breathing a ragged, wet, hitching sound that tore at her heart. By the time she hauled him over her own threshold and kicked the door shut against the howling storm, she was trembling with exhaustion, every muscle screaming in protest. She dragged him to the hearth, his body smearing a trail of mud and blood across the rough floorboards she'd scrubbed just that morning. The fire was down to embers, but she coaxed it back to life, feeding it precious kindling until a warm, golden light pushed back the gloom. In the steady glow, she saw him clearly for the first time, and a new wave of fear washed over her. His face, even twisted in pain, was formidable, a high brow, a jaw that looked like it was carved from granite. A fresh, deep gash ran across one cheekbone. His body, where the buckskin was torn, was a road map of old scars, white lines from knives, puckered circles from old bullets. This was not a man who got into fights. This was a man who lived a life of constant, brutal warfare. What in God's name had she brought into her home? Pushing the fear down, she got to work. She fetched the old leather medical bag her father had left her. Its worn, familiar smell was a small comfort. With a sharp knife, she carefully cut away the blood-soaked buckskin. The bullet had gone clean through. That was the only mercy. The entry wound was small, but the exit wound on his back was a ragged, brutal star of torn flesh. She boiled water, cleansing the wounds with carbolic soap that stung her own raw hands. The warrior remained impossibly stoic, his jaw clenched so tight she thought it might break, but he never cried out. Not even when she probed the wound for splinters of bone. She worked with a focused intensity, her movements sure and practiced. She packed the wounds with clean gauze and bound his chest tightly with strips of linen torn from her own bedsheets, her best ones. She forced a bitter tea of willow bark between his lips, trying to ward off the fever she knew was already gathering its forces. For 2 days and 2 nights the storm raged outside, and a different, more personal storm raged within the cabin. The warrior, whose name she still didn't know, was lost in a fevered delirium. He spoke in a language of harsh consonants and soft vowels, his words painting visions of galloping horses, of sharp, sudden violence, of blood on the desert sand. Amelia never left his side. She bathed his face with cool water, changed his bloody dressings, and when the tremors got too violent, she held his hand, her own small and pale against his dark, calloused one. In those long, isolated hours, the world shrank to the 4 walls of her cabin, to the rise and fall of a stranger's chest, to the desperate, unspoken prayer for one single life to hold on until dawn. She wasn't a settler anymore, and he wasn't an Apache. They were just 2 souls, adrift in a sea of pain. The fever broke on the 3rd morning. The storm outside had passed, and it was as if the sun had broken through the clouds inside the cabin for the first time. The warrior's eyes opened, and this time they stayed open. The lucid fire was back. He lay perfectly still, just watching her as she moved about the room. His gaze was intense, unnervingly perceptive, as if he could see right through her skin and into her soul. The silence that fell between them was thick with questions that neither of them knew how to ask. She set a bowl of thin broth on the crate beside his cot. "You need to eat," she said softly, knowing he wouldn't understand the words. She gestured, lifting an imaginary spoon to her lips. He pushed himself up slowly, a grunt of pain escaping his clenched teeth. He took the bowl, his hands surprisingly steady. He drank. He didn't thank her, not with words, but he held her gaze over the rim of the bowl, and in the dark, stony depths of his eyes, she saw an acknowledgement, a recognition. It was enough. The days that followed settled into a strange, quiet rhythm. They built a language without words. The clatter of the pot meant food. A certain tilt of his head meant he needed fresh water for his dressings. He was a model patient, never complaining, his body healing with a speed that astonished her. The hard life of a warrior had forged him from iron and will. She'd work her small homestead during the day, tending her garden, milking her goat, repairing the very fence he'd broken in his fall. But she was always aware of him, always casting nervous glances toward the horizon, her heart lurching at the sight of a dust cloud. The fear of discovery was a constant, bitter taste in her mouth. What if Thorne's riders came by? What if a patrol from Fort Grant passed through? Her act of mercy would be seen as treason. She'd be a dead woman. In the evenings, he would watch her. While she stitched a tear in her dress or oiled the action on the Winchester, she could feel his eyes on her. It wasn't menacing. It was analytical, curious. He watched the way her fingers moved, the way she tucked a stray strand of auburn hair behind her ear, the way her shoulders slumped with weariness when she thought he wasn't looking. It was as if he were memorizing her. One afternoon, he was strong enough to stand. He walked, stiff at first, to the cabin door and looked out across her land. He saw the vast, empty expanse, the small, lonely cabin, the single horse, the single goat. He looked at her, then back at the unforgiving landscape. A new expression crossed his face. Not pity. It was a kind of respectful understanding. He knew better than anyone what it took to survive out here alone. He began to repay his debt. She woke one morning to find him sitting by the hearth, her dullest kitchen knife in his hand. He was sharpening it on a smooth river stone, honing it to a razor's edge, testing its sharpness on a sliver of his own thumbnail. He noticed the wobble in her small table and, using that same knife, carved a perfectly fitted wedge to steady it. They were small, silent gifts of service. But the real test came a week into his recovery. A rattlesnake, fat and angry, had coiled itself near her woodpile, seeking warmth. Amelia, her mind 1,000 miles away, reached for a log. Her hand was inches from the venomous reptile. Before she even registered the dry, menacing rattle, he moved. He was a blur. He covered the 10 feet between them in 2 silent strides. He snatched her arm, pulling her back with a force that spun her around. With his other hand, he flung a rock with breathtaking speed and accuracy. It hit the snake's head with a sickening thud, killing it instantly. Amelia stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs, the ghost of a fatal sting still tingling on her skin. He still held her arm, his grip firm, his nearness overwhelming. He smelled of wood smoke, leather, and something uniquely masculine. He released her slowly, his dark eyes searching her face, checking for fear. In that moment, she saw none of the savagery the townfolk spoke of. She saw only a fierce, primal protectiveness. "Thank you," she breathed, the words feeling small and utterly inadequate. He just nodded, his gaze dropping to the dead snake before returning to her. In that shared brush with death, something shifted between them. He wasn't just her patient anymore, he was her guardian. The next evening, he sat by the fire, working on a piece of cottonwood with his newly sharpened knife. For hours, his hands were in constant, fluid motion. Amelia watched, fascinated, as a shape began to emerge from the pale wood. When he was finished, he held it out to her. It was a small, exquisitely carved bird, a hawk caught in mid-flight, its wings spread wide. The detail was astonishing, from the individual feathers to the sharp, determined eyes. It was a thing of simple, profound beauty. She took it, her fingers tracing the smooth lines. It was his story, his thanks, his goodbye, all carved into a piece of wood. She knew then that he would be leaving soon. The knowledge left a surprising hollow ache in her chest. She had grown used to his silent presence, to the quiet security it brought. The cabin would feel empty again. The loneliness would be sharper, more acute than before. 3 nights later, she awoke with a start. The cabin was utterly still, but she knew, with a certainty that chilled her, that she was alone. The cot by the hearth was empty. The blanket was folded neatly. The carved hawk sat on the table, its wooden eyes seeming to watch her. He was gone. Vanished back into the wilderness as silently as he had appeared. He'd left no tracks in the dust, no sign of his passage, only the mended table, the sharp knife, and the hollow space his presence had left behind. Amelia picked up the hawk, its wooden form cool against her palm. She had saved a man's life, and in return, he had given her a small piece of his soul. But he had also left her with something else. A silent promise whispered on the wind, and a whole world of trouble she couldn't yet imagine. With the warrior gone, the oppressive silence of the high desert rushed back in. The loneliness was a physical weight now, heavier than before. The carved hawk lived in her apron pocket, a constant, smooth reminder that the whole thing hadn't been a dream, but life on Blackwood Ridge didn't allow for quiet reflection. The shadow that had been gathering at the edges of her world began to creep closer, and that shadow had a name: Sterling Thorne. Thorne owned the vast Cimarron Cross Ranch, an empire of cattle and grass that bordered Amelia's small homestead on 3 sides. He was a man carved from the same hard rock as the landscape, with pale, predatory eyes and a soul-deep belief that the world was his for the taking. And he considered Amelia's little plot of land, with its year-round spring, an intolerable intrusion. That spring was the heart of her land. It was the reason her husband Thomas had chosen this spot. And it was the very thing Thorne coveted with a corrosive, all-consuming greed. His first attempts to buy her out had been civil, at least on the surface. He'd ridden up himself, a massive man on a magnificent black stallion, his silver-inlaid saddle worth more than her entire life. "Mrs. Hayes," he'd rumbled, a smile on his lips that never reached his cold eyes. "A woman alone has no business out here. It's dangerous country. I'll give you a fair price, enough to set you up proper in Prescott." "This is my home, Mr. Thorne," Amelia had replied, the Winchester held loosely but purposefully in her hands. "It's not for sale." Thorne's smile had tightened. "Everything is for sale, madam. It's just a matter of finding the right price." Now, he was done with finding the right price. One morning, she found 2 of her goats with their throats cut, their bodies left to bloat in the sun. A week later, her fence was torn down, and a dozen of Thorne's longhorns trampled her vegetable garden into ruin. She rode into Redemption Creek, a dusty, sun-bleached collection of false-fronted buildings, and went straight to the sheriff. Sheriff Brody was a man whose ambition had long ago been baked out of him by the Arizona sun. He sat with his boots on his desk, listlessly polishing his badge. "Sheriff," Amelia began, her voice tight with anger. "Thorne's men are destroying my property." Brody sighed, not even bothering to look at her. "You got proof of that, Amelia? Did you see him do it?" "Who else would it be? He wants my spring." "Sterling Thorne is an important man," Brody said, finally lowering his feet. "He pays the taxes that pay my salary. He says some of his cattle strayed, says he's sorry for the damage." "I don't want his blood money. I want him to leave me alone." "Now, Amelia," the sheriff said, his tone dripping with condescension, "you're getting hysterical. Maybe you ought to reconsider his offer. It's a lonely life for a woman out there." She left his office, her insides churning with a cold, helpless rage. The law in Redemption Creek wasn't a shield for the weak. It was a club for the powerful. Outside the saloon, she saw Thorne's foreman, a brutish man named Bart Grimes. His face was a mess of broken veins, and his eyes held a constant, simmering malice. He watched her pass, a cruel smirk on his face, and deliberately spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust near her feet. In that single, contemptuous act, she saw Thorne's hand as clearly as if he'd signed a confession. The final escalation came a few weeks later. She woke to a foul taste in her water bucket. Rushing to the spring, her heart pounding with dread, she found the source. A bloated, decomposing coyote carcass had been thrown into the clear pool, its fur rank and swarming with flies. Her water, her lifeblood, was poisoned. It was a declaration of war. Cleaning the spring was a sickening, back-breaking task. All the while, she felt watched. She'd see a flicker of movement on a distant ridge, the glint of sunlight off a spyglass. Thorne wasn't just trying to scare her anymore. He was laying siege to her home. starving her out, poisoning her well, and he was confident the law would do nothing but look the other way. That night, huddled by her hearth, the full weight of her isolation crashed down on her. The town was against her. The law was against her. The most powerful man in the county was actively trying to destroy her. She clutched the carved hawk in her hand, its sharp edges digging into her palm. She thought of the silent warrior with the watchful eyes. She remembered the feeling of his hand grabbing her arm, pulling her back from the snake. For those few weeks, she hadn't been alone. She had been protected. Now that protection was gone. It was just a fleeting memory. As the coyotes howled their mournful chorus from the surrounding hills, Amelia Hayes felt a fear colder and more profound than any she had ever known. Sterling Thorne's shadow was covering everything, and she was beginning to doubt she would ever see the sun again. The seasons turned, the green of spring bleeding into the bleached bone colors of a brutal summer. Amelia survived. Her stubborn resilience was a constant, infuriating thorn in Sterling Thorne's side. She dug a new, shallower well, a back-breaking task that yielded less water, but water that was hers alone. She spent her nights sleeping with the Winchester by her side, her ears tuned to every snap of a twig. Meanwhile, in Redemption Creek, the talk was no longer about Thorne's cattle. It was about a new, unsettling power rising in the territories. Travelers brought stories of a new Apache war chief, a man who was uniting the scattered, feuding bands under a single, formidable banner. They said he wasn't an old, established leader, but a young, ferocious warrior who had appeared as if from nowhere. He led his people with a tactical brilliance that baffled the cavalry, and a ruthlessness that struck fear into the hearts of settlers. Amelia heard the name for the first time in the Mercantile. "He's cleared the entire Dragoon Range," a frightened prospector said, his voice trembling. "Wiped out the survey team from the rail company. Just vanished 'em." "They call him Ronan," the other whispered, as if the name itself was a curse. "They say he moves like a ghost and fights like a demon." Amelia froze, her hand hovering over a sack of beans. Ronan. The name was unfamiliar, but the descriptions, they stirred a strange, deep disquiet within her. They spoke of a leader with eyes like chips of obsidian who carried the scars of many battles but moved with the grace of a panther. A man who appeared where he was least expected. The legend of Ronan grew. He became the boogeyman of the territory, and Sterling Thorne, in particular, grew obsessed. Ronan's newly claimed territory bordered the northern edge of the Cimarron Cross, effectively halting Thorne's relentless expansion. "This savage is an affront to progress," Thorne declared loudly in the saloon, making sure Sheriff Brody could hear. "Something must be done." Thorne began funding his own private army, offering handsome bounties for Apache scalps. His foreman, Bart Grimes, led brutal, indiscriminate raids into the foothills, inflaming the already volatile situation. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath. Amelia was trapped in the middle. The hatred for all natives had reached a fever pitch. Her one-time act of compassion was now a secret that could get her hanged. On a necessary trip for supplies, she was confronted by Grimes and two of his men. "Heard you keep to yourself, Widow Hayes," Grimes sneered, blocking her path, his breath sour with whiskey. "Don't get many visitors way out there, do ya?" "That's the way I like it, Mr. Grimes," Amelia said, keeping her voice level. "Funny thing," he continued, stepping closer, "some of the boys who was tracking a wounded buck a while back said the trail led right up towards your land, before that big storm washed it out." His eyes narrowed, glittering with malice. "You wouldn't know nothin' about harborin' vermin, would you, Mrs. Hayes?" Amelia's blood ran cold. It had been them, Thorne's men. They were the ones who had shot the warrior she saved. The connection, sudden and sickening, clicked into place. The attack on him hadn't been random. It was part of Thorne's bloody campaign to clear the land. Her land. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her hand instinctively going to her apron pocket, to the carved hawk. Grimes's eyes locked onto the movement. "You best be careful. In times like these, people who ain't with us are against us, And Mr. Thorne, he don't take kindly to people who are against him. He let her pass, but his threat hung in the air like poison. She hurried home, her mind a whirlwind. The man she had saved, the silent warrior who had sharpened her knife and protected her from the snake. He wasn't just any Apache. The descriptions, the timing, the fierce intelligence in his eyes, the location where he was shot. It all pointed to an impossible, terrifying conclusion. The nameless man she had pulled from the mud and the phantom chief named Ronan were one and the same. The knowledge was a dangerous fire in her heart. She was connected by a thread of secrecy and a shared enemy to the most feared man in the territory. Her small, isolated homestead was no longer a sanctuary. It was the dead center of a gathering storm. And she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that the storm was about to break. The attack came on a moonless night. The air was still and heavy, the kind of oppressive quiet that precedes violence. Amelia had been on edge for days, her primal instincts screaming that Thorne's patience had finally snapped. She'd barred her door and was sitting in the dark, the Winchester across her lap, just listening. The first sign was the smell of smoke. Not her own hearth. This was the acrid, greasy smell of burning hay and old timber. Her blood turned to ice. The barn. She burst out the door and saw it. Flames, angry and orange, were devouring the small barn that housed Balthazar and her goats. The terrified screams of the animals were a physical blow. Bart Grimes and 4 other riders were silhouetted against the blaze, their faces demonic in the flickering light. They were laughing. "Time to go, widow!" Grimes bellowed, his voice thick with malicious glee. "Mr. Thorne's made you a final offer." Rage, pure and undiluted, burned away her fear. She raised the Winchester and fired. The shot was hurried, meant to warn, and it kicked up dirt near one of the riders' horses. The men, startled by her defiance, answered with a volley of their own. Bullets chewed at the log walls of her cabin, splintering the wood inches from her head. She ducked back inside, her heart hammering. This was it. They weren't here to scare her anymore. They were here to burn her out or bury her. The frantic cries of her animals were cut short by the sickening finality of gunshots. Tears of fury and grief stung Amelia's eyes. "Come on out, little lady," Grimes taunted from the darkness. Amelia reloaded the Winchester, her hands shaking but her purpose firm. If she was going to die tonight, she would not die cowering. She took a deep breath, ready to charge back out the door. And then a new sound entered the night. It started as a low, chilling cry from the ridges, a sound that was half wolf howl, half human cry of vengeance. It was answered from another direction, and then another, until the night was filled with the terrifying, ululating war cries of the Apache. Grimes and his men froze, their jeering laughter dying in their throats. They spun around, peering into the impenetrable darkness beyond the firelight. The air, which moments before had been empty, suddenly felt alive, teeming with unseen menace. An arrow, fletched in black, hissed out of the night and embedded itself in the throat of one of the riders. He fell from his saddle with a choked gurgle. Panic erupted. The riders spurred their horses, firing blindly into the darkness. From that darkness, shadows detached themselves, warriors on foot, moving with a supernatural speed and silence, swarmed from the rocks. They were specters of death, their faces painted for war, their knives flashing in the firelight. It wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. Swift, brutal, and terrifyingly efficient. Grimes, his face pale with terror, wheeled his horse around, intending to flee. But a figure on a powerful pinto warhorse materialized from the smoke, blocking his path. The rider was taller than the others, his presence radiating an aura of absolute command. He wore no paint, but the firelight glinted off a map of old scars on his chest and arms. Amelia, watching from her doorway, felt her breath catch in her throat. Even from a distance, she knew him, the set of his shoulders, the way he sat the horse, the sheer coiled power in his stillness. It was the man she had saved. It was Ronan. He dispatched Grimes with a contemptuous, almost lazy grace, his war lance striking the foreman from his saddle. Grimes hit the ground with a heavy thud, his reign of terror ending in the dust of the home he had tried to destroy. The fight was over in less than a minute. The night fell silent again, save for the crackle of the burning barn. Ronan dismounted, his warriors melting back into the shadows. He walked towards the cabin, his moccasins making no sound on the hard-packed earth. He stopped a few feet from her, his face unreadable in the shifting light of the fire. He was no longer the broken, feverish man she had nursed. This was the chief from the legends, a man who held the power of life and death in his hands. He was intimidating, magnificent, terrifying. One of his warriors, an older man with a heavily lined face, stepped forward and spoke in clipped, heavily accented English. "He says the dead is not forgotten." Amelia stared, unable to speak, the Winchester still clutched in her hands. The warrior continued, his voice flat, translating Ronan's unspoken words. "You saved his life, a life for a life. That is our way. Your life here is over. The man Thorn will send an army for this. You will not survive." Ronan took a step closer, his dark eyes finally meeting hers. They were just as she remembered them. Intense, perceptive, ancient. The translator spoke the final, devastating words. "He is Ronan, chief of the people. He has not come only to save you. He has come to claim you. You will be his wife. This is the payment for the debt." The words hung in the smoky air, more shocking than the raid itself. It wasn't a proposal, it wasn't a request, it was a declaration of fact, delivered with the absolute authority of a king. The silent warrior she had saved from death had returned as a chief, and he had come to demand her life in exchange. The first light of dawn was bleeding over the eastern mountains, painting the smoke-filled sky in hues of gray and rose. The smoldering ruins of her barn were a black scar on the land, a funeral pyre for the life Amelia had known. The bodies of Grimes and his men were gone, vanished as if they had never been. Amelia stood before Ronan, the space between them charged with an impossible tension. The translator stood impassively by his chief's side. "Wife?" Amelia finally managed to say, her voice a whisper. The word felt foreign, absurd. "That's not, you can't just—" The translator conferred with Ronan in a series of low, guttural sounds. Ronan's expression didn't change, but his eyes never left her face. "He does not take what is not his," the translator clarified, his English slow and deliberate. "He was shot by the white ranchers' men because they want this land, this spring. The same men who would have killed you tonight. His fight and your fight are the same." The old warrior paused. "He owes you his life. In his world, a debt of life is paid with life. By making you his wife, he places you under his protection. It is the only way he can guarantee it. It is an honor." An honor. To her, it sounded like a cage. She looked around at the ashes of her home, at the vast, lonely landscape. What was left to protect? A piece of dirt that everyone was trying to kill her for? A life of solitude and fear? "I can't," she said, shaking her head. "My world is here. I am not one of your people." Then Ronan spoke, his own voice, low and resonant, a sound that seemed to bypass the translator and speak directly to a place deep inside her. The translator's words followed. "Your world wants you dead. This sterling Thorn killed your animals and poisoned your water. He sent these men to burn you out and put you in the ground. The man with the star in the town will not help you. He is owned by Thorn. If you stay here, you will be dead by sunset. They will say you were killed by an Apache raid, and Thorn will finally have your spring." Every single word was the cold, hard truth. She was trapped. Her own civilized world offered her only a shallow grave. This savage chief was offering her life, but at a price that stripped her of her identity, her past, everything she had ever been. "What kind of life would that be?" she asked, her voice trembling. "A prisoner in your camp?" Again Ronan spoke, and for just a fraction of a second, his gaze softened. He says, "You were not my prisoner when I lay helpless in your house. You will not be my prisoner when you are helpless in mine. You will be the wife of the chief. You will be respected. You will be safe." Safe? The word mocked her. Would she ever feel safe again? She thought of the long months of terror, of sleeping with the Winchester, of the raw hatred in Grimes's eyes. Then she thought of the quiet days of Ronan's recovery, the feeling of his hand pulling her back from the snake, the silent understanding that had passed between them. He was a killer, a warrior, a man of profound violence, but he had shown her a gentleness and a protective instinct that no one else in this harsh land ever had. He was offering her a choice between two fires, the consuming fire of Thorne's greed and hatred, or the unknown fire of a new life, among a strange people, at the side of a man she barely knew but was irrevocably bound to. "He does not force you," the translator said. "The sun is rising. Thorne will have heard the guns. He will gather his men. They will come. You can stay and meet them, or you can ride with us now. The choice is yours. But you must choose." Ronan held out his hand. It wasn't a plea. It was a simple, open invitation. A bridge between her world and his. To take it meant leaving behind Amelia Hayes, the widow of Blackwood Ridge. To refuse it meant her death. She looked at his hand, strong, calloused, the hand that had carved the hawk she still carried in her pocket. She looked up at his face, at the unyielding certainty in his dark eyes. He wasn't a savior from a storybook. He was a force of nature, as wild and unforgiving as the land itself, but he was also her only hope. The ghosts of her past, of her husband, Thomas, of her father, the doctor, all seemed to whisper warnings in her ear, but the raw, undeniable instinct for survival screamed louder. She took a deep, shuddering breath. The scent of smoke and morning dew filled her lungs. The sun crested the mountains, and its first golden ray fell across Ronan's face. It was the dawn of a new day, and the dawn of a new life, or the end of one. The time for choosing was over. Her decision, when it finally came, wasn't a surrender. It was an acceptance. She looked from Ronan's outstretched hand to the smoldering ruins of her barn, a structure she and Thomas had raised with their own blistered hands. She looked toward the distant dusty trail that led back to Redemption Creek, a town that had judged, dismissed, and finally abandoned her to the wolves. There was nothing left for her there but a shallow grave. Slowly, deliberately, as if moving through deep water, she raised her hand and placed it in his. His skin was warm and rough, his grip firm and instantly reassuring. It wasn't the possessive grip of a captor, but the steadying hold of an anchor in a raging storm. A silent contract was sealed. Ronan gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He released her hand and turned to his warriors, issuing a series of short, sharp commands. "You may take what you can carry." The translator's voice cut through her thoughts. "We ride in minutes." Amelia walked back into her cabin. The small room seemed alien now, a museum of a forgotten existence. What do you take when you're leaving a life behind? Not the practical things, not the iron pots or the wool blankets. She moved to the small wooden chest at the foot of her bed. From it, she took a worn, leather-bound book of poetry her mother had loved. Beside it, a small silver-backed photograph of her parents on their wedding day. Finally, she took her husband Thomas's simple gold wedding band from the small dish where she kept it. She closed her fist around it, the metal cool and solid against her skin. A promise to herself that she would not completely erase the woman she had been. When she stepped back outside, Balthazar was ready, saddled and waiting beside Ronan's fierce-looking pinto. The Apache warriors were already mounted, a silent, formidable company of ghosts given flesh by the dawn. Ronan swung himself onto his horse in a single fluid motion. He looked down at her, a silent question in his eyes. Amelia took a deep breath, placed her foot in the stirrup and pulled herself into the saddle. Just as she gathered her reins, a new sound intruded, the growing rumble of many hooves on the hard-packed earth. A cloud of dust appeared on the horizon, resolving itself into a posse of at least 15 riders. At its head, she could clearly make out the bulky form of Sterling Thorne, and beside him, the slighter figure of Sheriff Brody. They were coming to find her body, to enact their grim pantomime of justice, and for Thorne to finally plant his flag on her spring. A bitter, triumphant smile touched Amelia's lips. They were too late. Ronan saw them too. He showed no alarm. He simply raised his hand, palm out. His warriors responded instantly, fanning out into a loose crescent, a wall of silent, lethal discipline between their chief and the approaching riders. The posse reined in their horses 100 yards away, their confident charge dissolving into confused uncertainty. They had come expecting to deal with a lone, dead woman. Instead, they were faced with a line of impassive warriors led by the territory's blood-soaked legend. "Hayes!" Thorne shouted, his voice a faint, angry tear in the morning air. "What is the meaning of this? Are you a traitor?" Ronan and his warriors didn't respond. Their contempt was a more powerful answer than any threat. Ronan held Thorne's gaze for a long, charged moment. In that silent standoff, a new boundary was drawn, not on a map, but on the earth itself, with the undeniable promise of violence. This land, and the woman who had bled for it, were now under his protection. Satisfied, Ronan turned his horse. The gesture was dismissive, final. He nudged his pinto into a steady trot, away from Redemption Creek, and towards the high, rugged mountains to the north. Amelia fell into line beside him. She did not look back. There was nothing behind her but smoke, sorrow, and the impotent rage of lesser men. Ahead lay an unknown world. She rode beside the silent chief, their horses moving in an easy rhythm. She did not feel like a captive. In the face of the posse, he had stood before her, not behind her. It was a subtle distinction, but it meant everything. The trail ahead was uncertain, a path into a life she could not possibly imagine. But for the first time in 3 long years, she was not riding alone. And for better or for worse, she would follow this new trail all the way to its end. The story of Amelia Hayes and the Apache chief Ronan doesn't end here. It's where their true journey begins. Thrust into a new world, a new culture, and a marriage born from debt and desperation, their path is one of uncertainty and discovery. Did she make the right choice? Can a bond forged in violence and necessity ever blossom into something more? The Untamed West holds the answers. If this story of courage, survival, and the clash of two worlds captured your imagination, please let us know by hitting that like button. Share this tale with others who love the raw drama of the American frontier. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell. We have so many more stories from the Wild West to share with you, filled with unforgettable characters, heart-pounding action, and the enduring spirit of those who dared to carve a life from the wilderness. What future do you think awaits Amelia and Ronan? Let us know in the comments below.